Well, first of all, it's great to be here. It's great to hear David frame an argument about New Labour. And I was thinking to myself, probably second only to Tony Blair as a politician of the left, capable of framing an argument so successfully on a public platform. Very persuasive, very good stuff. But he did say, and I'm going to pick up the challenge, I do have things to say about what I consider to be the kind of Achilles heel of the New Labour project. It's fine to, and I think the line lose, 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 win, 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 lose, lose is fair enough, and give me a New Labour government any time over what we've got, and I'm sure everyone in the room probably agrees with that. But we have to ask why the legacy hasn't endured, why there's so little to build on. And I start with the lack, really, of a good political economy. Essentially, New Labour accepted the Thatcherite economic settlement. The lightly regulated British financial system would continue to conduct a privatised reflation, leaving private sector debt levels to reach astronomical levels and bank balance sheets to swell to incredible size, so that when the financial crisis broke in 2008, Royal Bank of Scotland's balance sheet exceeded British GDP. And in fact, the bank balance sheets collectively were 5 times our GDP. Unbelievable. Is that better? Oh, sorry, I'll imagine you've to hear what I've said. I could just drive on. Combine that with the lightly regulated labour market, 11 successive new deals, and they were very use the growth dividend to invest in public services along the lines that David outlined. Again, very good. And to the student who asked David that question about what would Keir Starmer, or could Keir Starmer and his team build on, for me, the Child Trust Fund and asset-based welfare, which I thought was a great reform at the time, and its cheerful abolition by the coalition government, a kind of criminal act, and also the 3,500 Sure Start network, which is greatly loved by Middle England as well as working class England. But that was an unstable settlement. It lasted for a decade and blew up in 2007-8. And please don't imagine that there was a world financial crisis and Britain was just a pimple on that. The absolute epicenter of it was London. And the Labour approach to financial regulation, and behind that its attitude to business in the round, was the precondition for that calamity. I think it makes it hard for Labour now on the past because of that, and the fall away in productivity growth and the weakness in the British economy now in 2022 has its direct antecedents in what was not done in the 10 years up to that financial crisis. It opened the way politically to the criticism from the left. I think that neither the way Ed Miliband approached his leadership nor Jeremy Corbyn could have happened without that financial crisis and the evident kind of lacuna in policy that triggered it. And I think there's a big question for us as kind of on the centre-left that actually is really hopeless veering from the wild extremes of Corbynism or Footism to kind of try and reclaim the centre ground without having a really clear political economy, without having a critique of capitalism how to reform it, how to challenge its power structures, to kind of improve the lot of workaday men and women. And that wasn't done. Stakeholder capitalism, the state we're in, was one of the ideas that was around in the run-up to 97. The book was the second best-selling economics book of the 20th century, and actually some of the ideas were picked up. And one of them, and one of the people who picked them up most aggressively was David. It was David's kind of lobbying that persuaded Tony to give his speech in Singapore advocating stakeholder capitalism. But once won, it fell away. And I just want to spend 1 minute and a half just itemizing what took place. And in particular, I want to remind you what what happened. The Company Law Review, set up by Margaret Beckett, was to change company law to change the basis of a company from being the prisoner of its shareholder and the primacy of the shareholder interest to all stakeholders, in line with the ideas in the state we're in. The Company Law Review deliberated for 4 years and concluded its deliberations in 2001. Tony Blair vetoed its inclusion in the manifesto in the 2001 general election, and again in 2005. It wasn't until for 4 years, the results of the Company Law Review sat on the shelf. And it was only in the autumn of 2005 that actually the bill went through Parliament. And then Gordon Brown, to the CBI, decided to gut the chief recommendation of the Company Law Review, that alongside Section 172 in the proposed Companies Act, every company in Britain was to publish an operating and financial review setting out to what extent it was meeting all the demands of its stakeholders, declaring its R&D budget, how it was going to innovate, what it was doing to conserve human capital. And by that time, British finance and British accounting and British insurance companies, British pension funds were very keen on it. But Gordon decided that it should be abolished, quote, to lift the regulatory burden off business, quote, to stop gold plating EU legislation. That's the nearest thing to that was being fundamentally economical with the truth. We move on. It's now, that happens in November 2005. A year later, Ed Balls, now City Minister, launches the City Task Force. Quote, the government's interest in the city and financial services is specific and clear: to safeguard the light touch and proportionate regulatory regime that has made London a magnet for international business. Ed goes on. The Labour government will outlaw the imposition of any rules that might endanger the light touch, risk-based regulatory regime that underpins London's success. 10 months later, there was to be the run on Northern Rock. The weekend of that run, it was obvious that to stem the run, Northern Rock should be taken into public ownership. It was eventually. But that was held off for some months. And in the act of holding it off, and all those desperate cues we saw of people withdrawing their savings, was one of the reasons why, when the real crisis unfolded over us in 2008, in September and early October, when famously Fred Goodwin said, "My bank is on the point of bankruptcy," and Gordon actually rose to the occasion and did take a lead, both domestically and internationally, in actually saving the system. The intensity of it, the scale of it, had been, the preconditions for that had been set up in the previous 10 years. And then when the whole thing was over, Alistair Darling, Chancellor of the Exchequer, set up, co-chaired a commission with Wim Bischoff to look at how the city should be regulated. His conclusion: the light touch regulation that preceded the crisis should be continued. It took Vince Cable and the coalition government to ring-fence commercial and investment banking in Britain. It's a calamity. Yes, when Peter Mandelson came back from the Commission and took over as business secretary. We launched Ministry New Jobs, we launched the industrial strategy, and there was a reframing of Labour's attitude to kind of business and finance. But it was far too late. Now, you can't look at the New Labour legacy, I don't think, without actually kind of looking that failure in the eye. We had a DLR, many of our great public companies were taken over, private equity grew in size and scale. And there are excuses, of course. The intellectual climate was being set by right-wing economists. There was references being made to the Glass-Steagall Act being repealed in the States. Yes, it was the nice decade. China had come on the scene, and there was a low inflation kind of environment and lots of kind of growth in world trade. You know, it was easy, in a sense, to imagine you could keep things cooking in the way they did. But I can't look at the New Labour years without actually asking big questions about why it was that actually really able people, and the team that David described were able, and some of them knew that actually there was kind of an alternate kind of prospectus to this one they were pursuing, why they didn't do it. And Tony himself could have sold a better line, I think. Could have sold a better line to the British people had he chosen to do so. Interestingly, I often think that if he'd become a Catholic before taking office and committed to Catholic social policy rather than converting to Catholicism when he left office, Catholic social policy, very kind of comfortable and advocate of stakeholder capitalism, we might not have been in the situation we're in. Anyway, it's opportunities missed. But there's one thing that actually New Labour did do, and which I really think is another thing that we can and must build on. And actually, I think that, and the vote yesterday in London, kind of from people with a degree who overwhelmingly vote Labour, by taking the proportion of the 18 to 21-year-olds who got to university to over 40% and approaching 50%. Tony Blair and New Labour actually created a progressive constituency that are there in our metropolitan cities. That can be built on. And I think he was absolutely right recently to recommend that we should drive on to 70%, which is something else which I think that Starmer and team could build on. But to the big question, there was an opportunity for New Labour to become the governing party. He could have become the first Prime Minister to win 3 general elections with others succeeding him. And I think those failures kind of opened up the opportunity that the right have exploited. And of course, we haven't talked about Europe, but that's for later on in the question and answer session. Thank you very much.